The Holy Gospel can be found on page 790 of your pew Bibles, if you would like to follow along. It comes from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 9th chapter, verses 18 through 26. While Jesus was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader in the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but is sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. And as we begin this fourth and final week in our sermon series, This Changes Everything, this morning we're blessed to have Joey Brueggemeyer, who's one of our fantastic young people here at Trinity and an 11th grader at Owatonna, to share with us. Joey?
Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator. When I was writing my sermon on Monday, I wrote about how Jesus saves us for dying on the cross for us. This is true. However, when I was reading what I wrote, I realized he saves us from so much more than that. This past November, my mother and I had the opportunity to go on the Chile trip to Epes. Now, I'm a pretty big history buff, and I read a lot of books beforehand, and I thought I knew everything I needed to know about Chile. I knew that they were under a cruel communist dictatorship from September 11th, 1973 till 1998. But what I failed to realize was that Augusto Pinochet was a sympathizer to Adolf Hitler. He built camps where he would send people if you disagreed with his political agendas or protested his regime. In the middle of the night, his secret police would come take you or just simply take you off the street. We were fortunate enough to tour one of these camps, and our tour guide was an actual survivor of them. She showed us around, and she showed us where they stayed. It was a 1 meter by 1 meter by 2 meter high wood box. They fit 4 people in these boxes all day, every day of the week, in the heat of the day and in the cold of the night. She said one thing that'll stick with me for the rest of my life. She said, if Jesus didn't tell her she would survive, she doesn't think she would have. See, in the back of her mind, she heard this little voice that every time she didn't think she could make it through would tell her, "I'll save you." She also said that this prison did one good thing for her, and that was meditation time with Jesus. She said her relationship with him became stronger than it ever has before. She doesn't believe that she would have gotten out of there, or her baby, if it wasn't for that voice in the back of her head. When I was at the ELCA youth gathering this past summer, I remember this lady walking out on the stage. It said she was a Lutheran pastor, but she didn't look like one. Her name is Nadia Bowles-Weber. And, well, Nadia is not your ordinary Lutheran pastor. Nadia has a church in Denver where she preaches to what she calls junkies, druggies, and inmates. These are the people that she invites off the street to come to her Sunday worship. People that probably don't know who God is. You see, she became a Lutheran pastor after giving a eulogy to one of her friend's deaths. She wasn't a believer in God, but after that eulogy, something spoke to her. She said something in the back of her mind told her, "I'll save you from what you're going through." She said it was Jesus. Jesus saved her from the drearies of what she was going through. In today's gospel, we hear about a girl who is saved by Jesus. But I don't think that's the important part of what the gospel is trying to tell us. When Jesus says, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you," I think he's talking about how Jesus saves us from everyday things and we don't even know it. You see, we all make mistakes every day, and we don't even know it because Jesus has already saved us from him. He wants us to walk with him and welcome him because no matter where we go or how far we try and run, he's still right there beside us. Even if you're in a prison camp or in between a rock and a hard place, if you just ask, Jesus will save you. No one is unworthy of his saving grace, mercy, or love, because no matter what, he has already saved us.
Thank you, Joey, for sharing from your wisdom and your experience. Today in our gospel, we encounter these three people who are desperately in need of the healing that Jesus can bring. Now, the first story is about Jairus, who is the leader of the synagogue. He's kind of like the church administrator, and his daughter is close to death. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in the position where someone you love is in hospice or is close to that time, but it is so difficult to sit vigil while you're waiting for your loved one to die, hoping against hope. And he heard about this Jesus traveling and teaching and healing, and he heard that Jesus was nearby. So maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. Jairus finds Jesus and pleads with him to come, and Jesus agrees. Think of the relief in Jairus' eyes. As they walked, there were these crowds all trying to get near to Jesus. They were pressing in close just to talk to him or see him. On the way in the crowd, this woman approaches who has a hemorrhage. We don't know her name, but we know that she's been very sick. She's been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. Think of the blood loss that's involved. Think of how weak she must have been. Think of the endless trips to the doctor's office trying to find some form of relief. But we also need to understand that in Levitical law, there were three things that made you ritually unclean. They were leprosy, body excretions, and death. Being ritually unclean meant that you could not touch or be around anyone else. So this woman was absolutely shunned by the rest of the community, because if she touched anyone or they touched her, even by accident, then they would become ritually unclean. And then until they went through a process of ritual purification, those who had touched her could not rejoin her families or their worshiping communities or anyone else. So this woman is not only ill, but she's isolated and alone. And so this woman is desperate and is going to take this chance. If she can just get to Jesus, if she can just catch up with him and maybe just touch his cloak, not actually touch him, but just the hem of his robe, then maybe, just maybe. And so she does. She touches his robe, and in that moment, suddenly she knows that she has been healed. Think of it. After 12 years of being sick, she suddenly, in an instant, feels healed. And then Jesus does this thing that might seem innocent, but to her, it must have seemed terrifying. He stops. He looks around, and he says, "Who touched me?" Well, the disciples, I'm sure, they just looked at each other and then looked at this giant crowd of people still pressing in and then looked at Jesus and said, "Really? All these people and you want to know which one touched you?" But he knows. He knows what happened. And she knows that he knows. And she comes forward. According to Jewish law, she had transferred her uncleanliness to Jesus. And think of all the people in the crowd who were pressing around her and Jesus and who are now full of fear. Did she touch me? Am I now unclean? But instead, Jesus looks at her not with anger or fear, but with compassion. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And she does. What a wonderful encounter. Completely the opposite of what anyone would expect. No one who'd read their catechism would expect a rabbi to be touched by an unclean woman and then call her daughter. But that's what Jesus does. And then Jesus continues on his way to Jairus' home, and they're on the way there when they get the word that Jairus' daughter has died. I've been to a lot of bedsides of the dying. But there is nothing so heart-wrenching or tragic as the death of a child. It's just wrong. Parents are not supposed to bury their children. And for Jairus, in that moment, all hope evaporates. All hope. But Jesus says, no, let's go on. He's reminding us that we are never beyond hope. Jesus comes to Jairus' home, and everyone there is wailing and weeping and mourning over the loss of this little child. Jesus bends over her, touches her on the forehead, and simply says, no, she's just sleeping. Well, they all laugh at him. She's not sleeping. She's dead. Anyone can see this. But Jesus kneels down next to her and takes her hand and tells her to arise. And she does. She just sits up. And then very practically, Jesus stands and steps back and looks over at her shocked father and says, you should give her something to eat. She's probably hungry by now. Well, here's what I believe. Just like Jairus, just like the crowd, just like that woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, just like the people who are gathered at Jairus' home, we too all desire some form of healing. We want our lives, our community, and our world to be healed. We live in a world where we all know someone who's suffering with cancer or some other disease. We live in a world where school lockdown drills are a regular part of our children's lives. We live in a world where people who live on the edges of society do not know if they have a safe place to turn. I'll say it again. We all want our lives, our community, and our world to be healed. What Jesus was telling the woman who was bleeding, what he was telling Jairus, and what he's telling you and me is to trust him. We trust in Jesus to heal. We trust in the Jesus who at age 12 astonished the religious leaders with his wisdom and teaching. We trust in the Jesus who was so compelling that people dropped what they were doing to follow him. We trust in the Jesus who, with just a touch, healed the sick and raised the dead. We trust in the Jesus who poured the wine and broke the bread and who causes our hearts to burn. We trust in the Jesus who was resurrected from the dead. Like Jairus and the woman, we too reach out. We just want to touch Jesus, even just the hem of his cloak, because we want to experience and we want our world to experience healing. And Jesus reminds us that he is here, in the Word, in the bread and the wine. He is here, and we trust in his healing. And while we don't completely understand it, we trust that Jesus changes everything. Thanks be to God. Amen.